Good evening, and welcome to our Sunday evening live stream Bible class from Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Menominee Falls in Germantown, Wisconsin, as we continue our live stream Sunday night Bible class looking at John's Gospel. This evening, we're going to be picking up where we left off last week, which is in John chapter 19, beginning at verse 4. We'll spend a little bit of time reviewing verses 1 to 3. If you'd like to pull up the lesson from last week's lesson dated 419, which covers chapter 19, verses 1 to 8, we're about halfway through that lesson. So you want to pull that up from a week ago. And then there's a new lesson posted in the Facebook feed for this evening, which covers verses 9 through 16a. So might want to have that pulled up because I do expect to at least get into that, if not finish it this evening. So that's kind of the plan for tonight, is to try to get through the sentencing of Jesus through chapter 9, verse 16a, and then that'll set us up to talk about the crucifixion at our next session. So that's kind of the plan for this evening. But before we begin with the review of the first three verses, let's begin with prayer. So we pray. Lord Jesus Christ, you revealed yourself to the Emmaus disciples so that you might clear their confusion about your resurrection and open their hearts to the meaning of the scriptures. We ask that you would do the same thing for us this evening, that as we open your word, we might see you as the center of the scriptures and the foundation of our faith. We ask this in all things in your holy name. Amen. Okay, so real brief review of what's happened so far. We've had the Jewish leaders have brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate to be, to be tried, and they've asked for capital punishment. Pontius Pilate goes in, has one interview with Jesus, comes back out, announces that there's no basis for a charge against the man. Goes back in, interviews him a second time. That conversation ends with the very famous "What is truth?" statement. Pontius Pilate comes back out, tries to announces again that Jesus there are no charge or a basis against him, and tries to convince the crowds to ask for Jesus to be released according to the custom of the Roman prefect giving a political prisoner back to the people for Passover. But they don't go for that strategy either. They ask for Barabbas instead. And so Pontius Pilate has to go to another plan, another way of trying to convince or trying to get Jesus away from being crucified without offending the sensibilities of his Jewish opponents. And this is where we began last week in chapter 19. And the new strategy that Pontius Pilate has is going to have Jesus beaten. And the idea here is in one side of the coin, the hope is to meet the Jewish leaders' demand for blood, so to speak, their demand for punishment for Jesus. So they're gonna meet that. Pilate is gonna mete out some kind of punishment for Jesus. At the same time, it seems that he is maybe trying to evoke a little bit of pity for Jesus. And then what we're going to see in tonight's lesson is that it's also another opportunity for Pontius Pilate to mock the Jewish leaders with having brought this kind of obviously a man of no threat, but having brought him to execution, he's gonna kind of rub that in their face a little bit. But let's just review the first three verses here. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. We talked at length last week about the three different kinds of flogging or beatings that the Roman government gave out. The first kind was kind of a light beating. Again, I'm not trying to make any light of it. It obviously is still being beaten. Still would have left you bruised and bloodied. But is in the grand scheme of things, that first level of beating wasn't particularly strong. The second level was a more serious beating, but it was kind of in and of itself the punishment for the crime. And then the third kind of beating is the beating within an inch of your life that would have always been accompanied by another aspect of punishment. And many times for non-Roman citizens, that would mean along with crucifixion. And we said that in the Synoptic Gospels, we hear that Jesus gets a beating And based on what we read there, it seems to be that third kind, that the most serious kind of beating, within an inch of your life, the kind of flaying that we talked about last week. Um, but this doesn't seem to be that same beating. So, as is so often the case in John's gospel, he supplements what we know from the synoptic gospels. He's not contradicting what's in the synoptic gospels. He's not telling a different story than what's in the synoptic gospels. But what he's doing is he's supplementing the synoptic gospels. So Jesus was actually beaten twice in his trial. The first time before the condemnation, the sentence was handed down. That was the lightest of the three kinds of beatings. And then the other kind, the more serious kind, that would have been given after the order to execute him and before his crucifixion. So then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. So we talked last week about how there's a couple of different levels going on here. On the one hand, you have just the delight of these Roman soldiers and having the opportunity to mistreat a prisoner. But more importantly, we have some very classical or typical Johannine irony going on here, where the enemies of Jesus speak better than they know, where the enemies of Jesus actually say things that are true. They're just true in a completely different way than the enemies mean them. So we saw earlier in the book, we saw Caiaphas say it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. And we kind of saw that as a prophecy that Jesus was going to die not only to take away the sins of one nation, but to take away the sins of the world. It is true, in a sense, that it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation or the whole world to perish. The same kind of thing is going on here. Yeah, certainly the Roman soldiers didn't have in any mind that they were worshiping Jesus. They had in mind that they were mocking him, and yet they do give him a crown. They do dress him in royal purple, and they do offer him homage. Hail, King of the Jews! And so, even though it's not what they intended, it is actually the kind of things that Jesus, as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, deserves. So again, in a ironic way, highly ironic way, in a way that the Roman soldiers are acting better than they know. They are giving voice to a true worship of Jesus as the King of Kings, even though that certainly was not their intention. And that brings us up to verse 4, which is where we want to um, start this evening with our notes. So, again, this is from last week's lesson, dated 4/19. It's called The Sentencing Part 1 and covers verses 1 to 8. And we're going to read verses 4 and 5 here, verses 4 and 5. So once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man," or in Latin, ecce homo, which becomes a very famous phrase in Christian art, and in literature. You may come across that phrase, ecce homo, behold the man. Uh, and again, this is great Johannine irony at work here. So, first of all, let's just look at the scene from Pilate's perspective. So, from Pilate's perspective, what's going on is he's had Jesus beaten. Again, he kind of has a couple of different things in play here. He still has as his ultimate goal the idea that he can get Jesus released without having to execute him. He has in the back of his mind the need to meet the demand for blood from the Jewish leaders. And he also has in mind the desire to mock the Jewish leaders. And so these Jewish leaders have brought forth Jesus as a supposed threat to the state, right? That supposedly speaking, he's this great threat to the Roman Empire, that he needs to be executed because he's such a great threat to good order or to Caesar's rule, right? Um, in other words, the charges that they're bringing against Jesus are very serious. You would think that Jesus is, based on the charges anyway, you would think that he's just this terrible, awful, powerful human being who's trying to overthrow the Roman government. But what Pilate effectively does by having Jesus flogged and then bringing him back out and bring him out in this dressed in this way with the crown of thorns and the purple robe, right? And he says, "Behold, this is the man. Here is the guy that you guys think is so dangerous. Are you really trying to convince me that I have no choice but execute this guy? He doesn't look dangerous at all. He's been beaten. Yeah, he's got a crown, but they're a crown of thorns. And yeah, he's dressed in a purple robe, but we're kind of making fun of him. We're dressing him in a soldier's robe. So the purpose of bringing Jesus out and then kind of officially presenting him to the Jewish leaders with this "Behold the man, here is the man." Then what Pilate is really doing is he's trying to get the Jewish leaders to realize the foolishness of their claim. They're claiming that this guy is this tremendous threat against the Roman government, and you look at him, and you can in just a fleeting glance, you can recognize that he is no threat. He's no threat at all to the Roman government. And so, whether it's the beating is to help meet the demand for blood from the Jewish leaders, maybe it's to elicit sympathy from the crowds, or maybe even from the Jewish leaders, thinking that they're going to see him bruised and bloodied and say, "Oh well, I guess that's good enough." But really, more than anything, what Pilate is doing is he's look what I can do to him. Look at him right now. He doesn't look dangerous at all, does he? But at the same time, that phrase, "Behold the man," especially in the context of John's gospel, is ironic. And it's ironic because, of course, John's gospel, more than any of the gospels, is focuses on the incarnations. We think back to the prologue. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, right? So, this idea of the eternal Word, the eternal second person of the Trinity, takes on a real human nature and becomes a real human being. He becomes a real man. And so you've got Pilate saying, "Behold, here's the man. Here is the Word who has become flesh." Of course, that's not what Pilate had in mind. But for those of us who have read the whole gospel, for those of us who know the whole story, for those of us who have the benefit of the prologue, that phrase, "the man," holds a whole another layer of meaning, because we know that that is the Son of God who has become flesh, the Word made flesh that is introduced to us in the prologue to the gospel. So, like is so often the case, you have irony going on here. You also have another Johannine theme going on here, that Jesus' glory is revealed in his suffering, in his weakness and his suffering. And so here you've got this great kind of um, presentation of Jesus. Here is the man. You would think that that presentation of Jesus would be of a great and glorious Savior. But here he is. Here's the Savior. Here's the Messiah. Here's the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Here's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You would think that the picture that would be given of Jesus in that context to be one of great glory, right? He'd be crowned, and he'd be dressed in royal robes, and he'd have a train of angels and of servants, and he'd be celebrating this tremendous kingdom. When in reality, this formal presentation of Jesus to the crowds, he is dressed that way, but in a very ironic way, uh, in a very mocking way. So we have two kind of big Johannine theories or themes going on there. The theme of Johannine irony, of which almost every verse in this section, there is Johannine irony. But then also you've got this idea of Jesus' true glory being revealed in his weakness and his suffering.
Mark Rundle wants to know if the Bible says anything about whatever happened to Barabbas.
All right, so Mark's question is, does the Bible ever say anything about what happens to Barabbas? And the answer is no. The only thing that we ever hear about Barabbas is that that he led a rebellion, so he was guilty of sedition, and then in the course of that, he committed murder. So we know the reasons for which he had been arrested. We can also piece together, because the crowds ask for him, that that was a part of a kind of a freedom fighter kind of movement to try to rescue Israel from Roman oppression. Remember that the Passover was a time of great nationalistic pride for the people of Israel, that they expected God to raise up a deliverer for them at the time of the Passover, just like he had raised up Moses to deliver them from Egypt at the time of the original Passover. So you had all these kind of nationalistic overtones going on, and you basically seem to have been part of that. So we know what he was guilty of. We know that he was intensely popular because the crowd asks for him instead of Jesus. But after that, after the crime that we hear that he commits, and after the fact that they ask for his release instead of Jesus, we never hear about Barabbas again. And at least as far as I know, I could go back and double check, but at least as far as I know, there's no extra biblical literature that mentions Barabbas either. So nothing like in Josephus or Philo or anything like that. So we really don't know much about Barabbas beyond beyond kind of the place where he intersects with Jesus' life, which, by the way, is very common for what we might call minor characters in Jesus' story. Think, for example, about Joseph, his stepfather Joseph. Joseph plays very prominently in the first two stories about Jesus' life, the story about the birth narrative, and then the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple. But after that, we don't ever hear about Joseph ever again. We never hear about him, probably because he died. But even that, we don't know. We don't know for sure that he died. So that's just kind of typical of these what you might call minor characters of Jesus, where they come on stage for a moment because they happen to cross the Savior's path, but then after that we don't really know anything about them. That's a good question, but at least as far as I know, we don't know anything beyond those kind of two things that we learn in the Bible about Barabbas. Okay, so with that in mind, let's move on to chapter 19, verse 6. So here's the response. Okay, so Pilate has had Jesus beaten. He brings him out, and this kind of dramatic flair brings him out and says, "Here is the man. Here is this guy you consider to be such a big threat to me and to the Roman government." And here's how here's the Jewish leaders reply. So verse 6. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." So a couple of things to point out about this verse. First of all, Pilate had hoped that by having Jesus beaten, he could satisfy the demand for blood from the Jewish leaders. But that plan doesn't work either. So you had plan number one, try to release Jesus by getting the crowds to ask for him to be released as the political prisoner. That didn't work because they asked for Barabbas instead. Here's strategy number two, have Jesus beaten in the hopes of stirring up sympathy or meeting the need for blood. Strategy number two doesn't work either. They will not be satisfied by anything less than crucifixion. So the only way that their thirst for blood will be met is if Jesus is actually executed, and executed in the most painful way that you can imagine. So they cry out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate then responds, and again, this is one of the things that can be a little difficult for us, is that it's maybe tempting for us to read the second half of verse 6 at face value. You take him and crucify him. You could almost read that and think, oh, Pilate is giving them permission to execute Jesus. And that, of course, is not the case. Pilate is not giving them permission to carry out capital punishment. He would never do that. So the second half of verse 6 has to be read very sarcastically. Um, so he says something like, something along the lines of this: you brought him before me to find out what my judgment is. My judgment is that there's no basis for a charge against this man. And so if you're not going to take my judgment, if you're not going to accept my judgment, if you're going to cry for his crucifixion, even though I said that I find no basis for a charge against him, then why did you bring him to me here in the first place? Why didn't you just crucify him? That's kind of the force of the statement. It's highly sarcastic, and it's another kind of way of rubbing it in the Jewish leaders' face, kind of mocking them by trying to help them see the foolishness of what they're doing. What's the point of bringing Jesus here if you're not going to care what I say, what my judgment is? I'd also say about this verse, there was one more thing. One more thing I had to say is just notice, I believe this is the third time, and it may be the fourth time. I think it's the fourth time that Pilate has announced that he finds no basis for a charge against Jesus. So we have this kind of refrain that echoes over and over and over and over again. It should strike us. It should the repetition should begin to strike us here that the writer or the evangelist is trying to emphasize a truth here, that Jesus really is a suffering servant. He's really a righteous sufferer, that he does not deserve this treatment that he's getting from Pontius Pilate or from the Jewish crowds. Now, of course, we know that as the reader, but the fact that this is being emphasized again and again and again is going to it brings into relief. It brings into greater, contrast the innocence of Jesus with the guilt of Pilate and the Jewish leaders. And then verses 7 and 8, to bring this little first section to a close, the Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now, what's very interesting about this verse is, remember that when the Jewish leaders first brought Jesus to Pilate, they brought a purely political charge against him, that he claimed to be a king, and that he was in effect setting himself up as a rival to Caesar. So that Pontius Pilate had to get rid of this pretender who was trying to claim the crown or the throne of Jerusalem, the throne of the Jews, kind of in rebellion against Caesar. So at first, the claim or the charges that are brought against Jesus are purely political. Here, though, we have the true motives of the Jews unveiled, right? They didn't really care. They didn't really think that Jesus was a king, and they didn't really think that Jesus was a threat to the Roman Empire. They were just trying to find a nice politically expedient way of getting rid of Jesus. And so here, having been stymied by Pilate over and over and over again, with Pilate's kind of insistence of refusing to get rid of Jesus, refusing to hand him over to be executed, coming back over and over and over again with this, "I find no basis for a charge against him," they kind of, maybe in frustration, they kind of revert to the real problem that they have with Jesus. And the real problem they have is that they say, "We have a law. We Jews have a law. There's a part of the Mosaic law that says a blasphemer has to be put to death. And we know this guy is a blasphemer because he called himself the Son of God." Now, what's important to note about that phrase, the Son of God, is that it meant something to the Jewish ear and it meant something to the Roman ear, and it didn't mean the same thing to both. In other words, that phrase, Son of God, carried overtones in a Jewish aspect that were very different than the overtones in a Roman aspect. Or another way of saying that, another way of bringing that into relief is the term Son of God has one kind of meaning in a strongly monotheistic society, Judaism. Okay, so Judaism's basic claim is that there's only one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? So that's one of the things that makes Judaism unique, especially in the Roman Empire, is that they're a religion that only believes in one God. So to have somebody say, I am the Son of God, in the context of Judaism, is blasphemy because there's only one God. So if this guy claims to be the Son of God, he's claiming to be God. And that's why they think Jesus is a blasphemer. And of course, anybody except Jesus who made that claim would be a blasphemer. But Jesus is the only one that can rightly make that claim. However, that phrase "son of God" or the sons of the gods, or a son of the gods, is in a polytheistic society like the Roman society, like Roman religions. A son of the gods is kind of what you might call a demigod. A demigod. Somebody who isn't quite fully God, but because they maybe have like a divine parent, they have superhuman abilities. And so just think about people from Greco-Roman mythology who have abilities that go beyond that of a mortal man. So think about like Achilles, who can't be killed unless there's this one place on his heel that gets harmed, right? Or you've got Hercules, who is the son of the gods, who can perform all these great trials of Hercules to prove his worth to his divine father. So when the Jews say, we have a law and he must be put to death because he claimed to be the Son of God, they are essentially repeating the claim that Jesus has committed blasphemy. Okay? And that fits very well in everything that we've read so far in the gospel. That's what really bothers the Jewish leaders about Jesus, is his divine claims about himself. But then the reason I went through that whole explanation is to explain what comes next. So they said, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. And then what we read next is in verse 8, when Pilate heard this, he was, and then I just noticed, is there a footnote? There isn't. When Pilate heard, the Greek says, when he heard this, he was rather afraid. He was rather afraid. Now, what the NIV has chosen to do with that rather is to make it a comparative. So they say he was even more afraid. The problem with that is that Pilate is not afraid. Pilate has never been afraid in this whole conversation with Jesus. Going back to chapter 18, when they bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate to be to bring their charges against him. From that moment on, Pilate has never been afraid. He's been angry. He's been annoyed. He's been scornful. He's been taunting, but he's never been afraid. And so the NIV translation there, I think, is puzzling. It gives the impression that there was a level of fear that was not there before. And so I think the way that we have to understand verse 8 is not that Pilate grew even more afraid, but that he grew rather afraid. When he hears this statement that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, or the Son of the gods, he has kind of in his mind, his superstitious pagan mind, his polytheistic mind, what if I just had a son of the gods flogged, right? What if I just angered one of the gods, or I angered this kind of more than mere human being, this kind of superhuman being by flogging him? And this is why he becomes afraid. Roman leaders were not particularly religious, but they were incredibly superstitious. They never wanted to do anything that upset the gods, that might bring bad luck or bad voodoo on them, or whatever you want to call it. And so Pilate is rather afraid that by his actions he has offended somebody that he shouldn't have offended. He ought not have offended. And so, what I'm suggesting to you is that you should see not that he became more afraid, not that he was rather more afraid, but that he was just rather afraid. He was quite afraid. His fear reached a very high level as he wants to find out. Now he wants to know, did I do something wrong against someone that could really make my life miserable for having done it? Rachel.
I mean, is it possible that even though it didn't say he was afraid before, this is letting us know that he had some fear?
Yeah, so Rachel's question is, could this be revealing to us that that there really had been fear before and now there's even more? That's what I'm going to say to you is that I know that is a possible reading of the English, but that's not a good reading of the Greek. Okay, so what the Greek statement says, it doesn't say that he was more than afraid, like the NIV does. The NIV says that the Greek says that he was rather afraid. So the question is, what does that rather modify? Um, is it he was rather afraid compared to the fear he had before? That's the kind of reading that the NIV gives you. But the problem with that reading is that there is no sense that he had fear before. Right? So the much more common, the much more natural way to read the verse is that rather modifies the fear that he had. It isn't that he was more afraid, it's just that he was rather afraid. He was quite afraid. He was really afraid. So in other words, it really becomes an adverb, not a comparative adjective. And the NIV just doesn't do us any it doesn't do us any possible. Sure, it's possible. I guess I'd say it's a 0.01% possible that that's the proper interpretation. But um, at least in the scholarly commentaries that I read to prepare for these, everybody is in agreement that that's just a poor translation. It makes much more sense to take the word rather as an adverb instead of a comparative adjective. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, then don't worry about it. You don't need to know the comparative adjectives and adverbs and all those things. But it is a question that is very rightly raised in this verse because the comparative form and the adverbial form look the exact same in Greek. Okay. Um, and then so notice that we stopped right in the middle of a sentence, right? So he said, when Pilate heard this, he was rather afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Oh, sorry, and I didn't. We even stopped. He was even more afraid. Then we stopped right there. And so what I'm and I invite you to do now is to pull up the lesson for today, which is going to begin right at that lesson or right at that verse. So verse 9, the other half. And the reason that this is actually a pretty logical spot to divide is because beginning in verse 9, Pilate's going to have his third and final interrogation of Jesus. So remember, you had the first interrogation. Um, uh, you know, who are what are the charges they brought against you? The second interrogation, are you a king? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were so, I would have my followers would have fought to prevent my arrest, but everyone is on the side of truth listens to me. And then in the what is truth response. And then this is going to be the third and final interrogation of Jesus. And remember, this one is prompted which strikes his Roman ear as meaning he's some kind of superhuman being. And that explains why he asks the question that he asks. Okay, so sometimes what people have wondered is why does he begin the third interrogation with this particular question? And what helps us understand the motivation behind this particular question is he's trying to figure out whether Jesus is a son of the gods or not. Right? He's trying to figure out Jesus' origins. Okay, so with that in mind, let's read verse 9. And he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. So a couple of things going on here. So first of all, you've got this question which we've already kind of explained. Where did you come from? Why is it that Pilate is suddenly interested in where Jesus is from? It's because he's afraid that he's ticked off a superhuman being, or maybe that he's ticked off the gods who are the parents of this superhuman being. And so he's interested in finding out where Jesus is from. That might give him a clue about whether or not he needs to be worried, right? So that's one thing they have going on, the question. But the other thing, the kind of more interesting thing that I think, is that Jesus gives no answer. And you might ask the question, well, why doesn't Jesus answer? And the answer is, it really isn't that Jesus doesn't answer. The answer really is that Jesus has already given his answer. He's already said that my kingdom is not of this world. If it were so, my followers would have fought to prevent my arrest, but now my kingdom is from another place, right? That Jesus has claimed to be from above, that his kingdom is from above, that his kingdom is not of this world, that everyone who's on the side of truth, that's going to change that. There's no Pilate has already shown himself to be unwilling to listen to Jesus. Jesus' answer to that question, that he's from above. And so Jesus, in his wisdom, and partly as a fulfillment of prophecy, that like as a sheep before its shears is silent, so not a word came out of his mouth, Jesus remains silent. I have a little rhetorical question. What answer could Jesus possibly give to a Roman prefect who is more interested in political maneuvering than in justice? There's really nothing that Jesus can say that is going to satisfy Pilate at this point. And so he decides to remain silent. Okay, I'll move on now to verse 10. So when Jesus gives no answer, and that really ticks Pilate off. So I think you ought to read verse 10 with having some heat behind it. There's some anger here. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Now, there are a couple of really interesting things that are going on in this verse. And again, this is just classic Johannine irony. But the first thing is the English word order. The NIV translates it fine. It's into good English, but the Greek actually has the to me pulled ahead for emphasis. So one of the things that you can do in Greek sentences is to put, if you want to emphasize something, you put it the very first thing in the sentence. And so the Greek literally would read something like, to me, do you refuse to speak? Don't you realize, have the power to free you or crucify you? So Pilate's really taking this as a personal affront that Jesus refuses to answer him. So you got that kind of interesting aspect, that Pilate is really upset that Jesus isn't talking, that Jesus isn't piping up, or that Jesus isn't cooperating, that Jesus has decided to shut down at this point. But then you've got this other aspect going on where you've got Pontius Pilate claiming that he has authority over Jesus. And the NIV, unfortunately, has another kind of when it says, don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? What the Greek actually says is, don't you realize that I have authority either to free you or authority to crucify you? The word authority is repeated twice in one sentence. You might say, well, what's the significance of that? So what? Well, if you think back to John chapter 10, which is the Good Shepherd chapter, you're going to hear part of it as our gospel for this coming Sunday, a week from today, for Easter 4. Easter 4 is always Good Shepherd Sunday, and the gospel always comes from John 10. Though I'm pretty sure this year that's the first 10 verses, so you're not going to hear this actual part of John 10. But I have it listed here in the notes. John 10 verses 17 and 18. Jesus said, I lay down my life for the sheep. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to receive it back. So Jesus has also said these words, I have authority and I have authority, twice in the same sentence. And they fly in the face of what Pilate is claiming here. In other words, what we ought to see going on as readers who have read John 10 is we should see that there's kind of a conflict here. Who actually is in control of all this? Is Pilate in control? Does Pilate really have the authority to either set Jesus free or to crucify him? Because that isn't what Jesus said in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, Jesus says that he has authority to lay down his life and that he has authority to take it up again. So who's really in charge here? And of course, this goes back to one of the great themes of John's depiction of the Passion that we've pointed out several times, and here we have it again, that even though it doesn't seem like it on the surface, on face value, it doesn't seem like it, and yet in reality, Jesus never loses control in this entire situation. Everything is happening exactly according to plan. And Pilate's quote-unquote authority over Jesus is really just an exercise of the authority of Jesus himself. Jesus has the authority to lay down his life, and it's going to be through Pontius Pilate that Jesus is going to choose to use that authority. He's going to lay down his life by allowing himself to be crucified by Pilate. Okay, but so that's one kind of aspect of it, is you've got this kind of contrasting ideas of where the authority lies. Is it with Jesus or is it with Pilate? And from a worldly perspective, you'd have to say it was with Pilate. But if you've read the gospel, and especially if you've read the Passion history up to this point, you know that appearances are deceiving, and that in reality, Jesus is in control of everything. But then you've also got, I think we should see this little statement, don't you know that I have authority to set you free? We ought to see that as being highly ironic. Because remember that Pontius Pilate has 4 times announced that Jesus is not guilty. If Pilate really had the authority to set Jesus free, how come he hasn't done it yet? The reality, though, is that Pilate is so caught up in his political maneuverings. He's so caught between these. We talked last week about the horns of a dilemma. Whether he's caught between a rock and a hard place. He doesn't want to look weak before the Jewish leaders, but he knows that he can't afford to have a riot in Jerusalem during the Passover, that it would literally cost him his life. It would cost him his commission, and it would cost him his life. So he's kind of in this, between a rock and a hard place. He's kind of in this, on the horns of a dilemma. And so he really doesn't have the authority to let Jesus go. If he did, he would let him. But the fact that he's going through all of this effort and all of these, tricks in his bag to try to get Jesus to be released, even though he finds no charge for a basis against him, shows that he really doesn't have the kind of authority that he claims to have. So it's really kind of an empty threat. When Pilate says, don't you know that I have authority to set you free? I mean, you can kind of imagine if it weren't for the solemnity of the situation, you can kind of imagine Jesus kind of smirk at that. Oh, really? You think you have the power to set me free? Then why don't you? You've already announced 4 times that there's no basis for a charge against me. So I think we ought to see that too. Pilate probably doesn't have as much control over the situation as he thinks he does. Okay, and then so here's Jesus' response to Pontius Pilate's question. Don't you know that I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, verse 11, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. And I would suggest to you that verse 11 is the most difficult verse to interpret in chapter 19. It's among the most, I'll say it that way, it's among the most difficult questions to wrestle with in the whole gospel, which is, to whom is the one who is more guilty than Pilate? Exactly to whom does that refer? But before we get to that, let's talk about the first statement. Jesus said, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. So what we have going on here is another thing we have seen throughout the gospel, and that we see again here, is that when Jesus looks at, or when the New Testament writers look at what happens to Jesus, they ultimately see the hand of God behind everything. That ultimately Pilate is an unwitting instrument in the hand of God, that he is fulfilling God's plan or God's will, even though he doesn't know he's doing that, even though it's totally against his understanding or his knowledge, or it may not against it, but without his understanding or his knowledge. So we have this kind of standard New Testament understanding of the sovereignty of God, that nothing escapes the sovereign God, that all things work together to accomplish his will, especially when it's that preeminent will, the will of that wins our salvation in the world. He lets nothing get in the way of that, and only uses the evil of the world to bring about the salvation of the world. But let's get to the really difficult part. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Before we talk about the identity of the one who is greater guilt, one of the things I want to emphasize is that this is not Jesus' way of excusing Pilate's guilt. This is not Jesus exonerating Pilate. This is not Jesus just saying to Pilate, well, just so you know, you're not guilty for what you're doing, because you're just a tool in the hand of God. We have these two things, and this is the discussion question for this lesson, probably won't get to tonight, but these are the two things that two biblical statements that are true, which seem to be in conflict, but you have to hold on to both. So on the one hand, we believe, and the Bible teaches us, that God is completely and unconditionally sovereign, that there's nothing that can make God do anything, that God is always and completely in control of everything, that God never loses control. That's one of the truths of the Bible, is that God rules over everything. He's totally and unconditionally sovereign. And yet, on the other hand, the Bible emphasizes that the evil that people commit, the evil that I commit, is really my own fault. I'm really culpable. I'm really guilty of my sins. I can't just say, well, if God is really sovereign, then my sin must be a part of his plan. I can't blame God for my sin. So you got these two sides of the coin that you have to hold on to: the perfect sovereignty of God and the real culpability of human sin. And we're going to talk about, at the end of this lesson, when we get to the discussion question, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we reconcile those two things together. But just what I want to emphasize here is that Jesus is not saying to Pilate, you are innocent in this. That's not what he's saying. What he is saying to Pilate, though, is that, you don't even realize what an insignificant role you actually play in this whole thing. That when it comes right down to it, the one who started all of this is the one who has the greater guilt. It's not that Pilate doesn't have guilt. It's not that Pilate is innocent or that he's not guilty even. He does have guilt. He is culpable for not setting Jesus free, even though he's found no basis for a charge against him. But what Jesus is trying to bring to the fore is that there is one who has even more guilt. The one who handed me over to you, Jesus says. So now let's talk about who that is, who the identity is. And what I want you to do right now, hopefully you haven't read the lesson, but I want you to decide in your own mind who this is. Who do you think the one who is more guilty than Pilate is? Just who do you think that is? Okay, or as you've read this verse, or as you've heard this verse read in the Passion History at church, who has always come to your mind as the one who is more guilty, because he has handed you over to me? The first thing handed me over to you. The first thing to note is that the he is a singular. That the one who handed me over to you. So this can't be a group of people. that this has to be a single individual. So the most likely candidate for the identity of this individual, and certainly the candidate that would have first come to Pontius Pilate's mind, is Caiaphas. Okay, you might say, well, where did he get that from? Well, remember that even though the Jewish people considered Annas to be the high priest, kind of the real high priest, Caiaphas is, in the Roman eyes, is the official high priest. And he is the one who officially brought the charges against Pilate, so against Jesus to Pilate. So if you want to ask, if you want to answer the question, strictly speaking, what's one person handed Jesus over to Pilate? The answer to that question is Caiaphas. Okay. However, what you and I know about Caiaphas is that he's really just a pawn of Annas and the other Jewish leaders. That he's not really responsible for handing Jesus over to Pilate. That wouldn't have even been possible if there hadn't been betrayals before that. Okay, so that leads to interpretive option number 2, which is the option that I always guessed before I've answered, is who is more guilty is Judas. And of course, there's a very good reason for thinking that, which is that the gospel identifies Judas as the betrayer over and over and over and over again. That's the term that is specifically used to describe Judas every time Judas is mentioned in the gospel, the one who would betray him. So when you have Jesus talking about the one who betrayed me to you, handed me over to you, Judas naturally comes to our mind. And what I'd say is, could be, but strictly speaking, Judas did not hand Jesus over to Caiaphas, hand Jesus over to Pilate. Strictly speaking, Caiaphas did that, right? So strictly speaking, if Jesus is talking about the one who handed me over to you, that can't be Judas. Judas's betrayal allows Jesus to be handed over to Pilate, but Judas wasn't the one who handed him over to Pilate. That would have been Caiaphas, right? So the answer could be Caiaphas, but there's reason to think it isn't. It could be Judas, but there's reason to think that it isn't. Well, if it isn't Caiaphas and it isn't Judas, then who is it? And one of the most common arguments, especially by conservative Christian commentators who have a high view of the Bible, is the devil. That the one who has greater guilt than Pilate is the devil. And again, it takes us all the way back to the very beginning of history, when Adam and Eve fall into sin for the very first time. That makes the Savior's death necessary, is Adam and Eve's falling to the temptations of the devil. Remember that in John chapter 8, Jesus had talked about the devil being a murderer from the beginning. And I have in your notes the quote from 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, that the devil has been sinning since the beginning. And so many conservative Christian commentators think that what Jesus is kind of saying here, for the benefit of readers who are in the know, is that what is happening between him and Pilate is really a showdown between him and Satan. That there's a cosmic battle that is going on here that Pilate was not at all aware of. Okay, so so the answer is, well, which is it? Is it Caiaphas? Is it Judas? Or is it the devil? I don't really know. You can make a case for all. You can make a case for all of them, and I think you can make a case against all of them. And that is what, again, that's what makes the question really difficult. It makes it one of the what makes it one of the most difficult questions in the chapter and in the whole Passion. And I wish I could give you a real clear, definitive answer, but I can't. Um, but what Jesus, regardless of exactly to whom Jesus is referring, what Jesus is saying to Pontius Pilate is, you think you're in the driver's seat here. You think that you are kind of the be all and end all of meting out justice, but you really are a minor player in all of this. That you are really just a tool in the hand of God, and that we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the betrayal of others first. So Jesus is letting Pilate know that he ought not think quite so much about himself. He ought not get too high on his horse. Rachel.
Roberta says, all the people involved are playing a part. John's famous passage saying that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. By theory, wouldn't God be the one who handed Jesus over? Even Satan couldn't take Job's life.
Okay, so Roberta's question very perceptively gets at where we're going to get at the end of this lesson, which is how do you balance divine sovereignty with human responsibility? And essentially what Roberta is asking is, if God is sovereign over all things, then isn't God responsible for handing Jesus over to Pontius Pilate? And I guess if you want to, I guess you could make an argument for that. And the argument that Roberta has made is by appealing to John 3:16. That for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. Right? So God is the actor there. That God gave, or maybe even gave over. That's not the it. You couldn't translate John 3:16. God betrayed his only son. Gave as a gift is the word that's used there. Didomi is the word that's used. Um, so maybe a good way to say it is something like this. We like to talk about God's permissive will, about what God permits. But just because God permits something doesn't mean that he is responsible for it. And so the example that I like to use for this is the Twin Towers, which for me anyway, for my generation, is kind of the great tragedy of my generation. For some people, it was um, John F. Kennedy being shot. For some people, it was the explosion of the Challenger shuttle. For some people like me, it was the 9/11. They're saying now for Generation Z, it's COVID-19. That's the great disaster for Generation Z. But when those men chose to fly planes into the Twin Towers, that was not God's will. That was not what God wanted. God was not responsible for flying the plane into the Twin Towers. The sinful human beings who did that were responsible. It is true that God allowed it, that if God had wanted to, he could have stopped it. That God, who is totally sovereign, could have made the plane disappear, or he could have made the plane go right through the Twin Towers and appear to the other side. Or he could have prevented the men who hijacked the plane from ever getting on in the first place. He could have prevented them from ever being born. I mean, there are all kinds of different ways that he could have prevented that from happening. But he doesn't. And we call that God's permissive will, what God allows to happen, even though it goes against his will. And the reason we emphasize that is because it helps us, or it helps maintain the real human culpability. Here's kind of the big reason I would not want to say something like, in this particular context, I would not want to identify the one as God. And the reason is because Jesus calls that one guilty. That Jesus describes that one as being more guilty than Pilate, is more guilty of sin than Pilate. And the Bible is very clear that God cannot sin. God does not sin. Right? So if Jesus is talking about one whose guilt is greater than Pilate's, I'm trying to look at anyone. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. There's no way that one can be God, because God can't sin and he can't be guilty of sin. So I think it's a very interesting philosophical argument, right? Is God ultimately responsible for Jesus being handed over? He is, in the sense that this is the eternal plan, right? The eternal plan from all eternity. God planned that he was going to give his one and only son as the savior of the world. But that's not what's being taught in this particular text, in this particular verse. And we know that because of the reference to sin, and God can't be held responsible for sin. Okay. So Rachel's giving me the sign that it's 8 o'clock. So we're going to pause there. God willing, next week when we meet, we'll finish out the sentencing, and then we'll get into the next session, which, I'll be honest with you, I'm going to treat very conservatively and very reverently, the crucifixion of Jesus. We're just going to kind of go through these events that are recorded in John's Gospel. We're not going to tear them apart or look at them as merely literature, but just going to kind of stand in awe of them as we see the depths to which our Savior was willing to go to win our salvation. So next week, God willing, we'll finish the sentencing and then begin our conversation of the crucifixion of Jesus. Well, let's close with prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, we give you our thanks and praise that you were willing to appear before Pontius Pilate, that you were willing to keep your mouth closed as a sheep before its shears is silent, that you were willing to be condemned to take our guilt away. We ask that you might help us live in this week in the sure and certain confidence of our forgiveness, and that you might open our lips to speak of your grace and the many opportunities that you give us in the week to come. We ask this in all things in your holy name. Amen. So thank you very much. God's richest blessings to you, and God willing, hope to see you soon.